We'll talk a little bit now about CR, or computed radiography, which is one of 3 types of digital radiography. We described the first 2. We had direct capture DR and indirect capture DR, and now we have CR. CR is the first type of digital radiography, plain film digital radiography, and let me explain how these cassettes, imaging plates, work. So those cassettes are very similar. The CR cassette that I showed you and the film cassette that I showed you, very, very similar in their design, in their function. They're designed to hold the plate, right? Whether it's a piece of film or the actual imaging plate. These imaging plates, called CR phosphor plates, are made in layers. Okay, so let me start with the base layer. So what you're looking at right now in this image is a cross section. Okay. When you look at the bottom of this image, the base, that's the back of the plate, the black back of the plate. And the top layer, the protective layer, is the front, the white shiny front that you're seeing. Okay, and so from top to bottom, rather bottom to top, the base is made of aluminum, just a sheet of aluminum to give it some thickness and some structure. Above that, we have what's called a reflective layer. It reverses light traveling backward, so we don't overexpose the receptor, the plate. An anti-halo layer, preventing laser light from reaching the reflective layer. I'll explain what the laser light is in a little bit. Laser light is part of the processing components. But most importantly is this layer that my laser pointer is hovering on right now, called the photostimulable phosphor layer. This is the functional part of the cassette. This is the part that's doing the work, okay? And above that is a protective layer, okay? So we need to work to understand the photostimulable phosphor layer, the actual phosphor portion. The phosphor layer, as it says here, converts X-rays into visible light, but not like the DR or indirect DR do. Okay, where indirect DR will convert X-rays to visible light, then into electric current, and direct DR converts X-rays into electric current, but they do it like immediately, right? This will take the X-ray exposure and it will hold on to it. It will hold on to it until the plate gets into the processor, okay? And then the X-ray energy is released as visible light, okay? Before we get there, let's talk a little bit about the cassette that surrounds the plate. The CR cassette, the green one on the table with the black surface, is usually made of aluminum or plastic with a low absorbing carbon fiber front. So the face, that black face of the cassette, is often made out of really, really light materials like carbon fiber. The back panel is often lined with lead or a very thin sheet of lead to reduce what's called backscatter radiation. This is radiation that is passed through the cassette and is now trying to bounce off of like the wall or something behind or under the floor, something like that, back at the plate. It keeps that from happening. The front and back panels of the CR cassette, where the actual plate slides in, are lined with felt, typically, that minimizes the buildup of static electricity and cushions the imaging plate. Unlike film cassettes, there is no need for them to be light tight. Okay. However, if they're kept in, if the plates are kept out for like long periods of time, they will absorb the natural background radiation that we're all receiving, and they will become fogged. I'll explain fogging a little later. But unlike the film cassettes that needed to have those light tight latches and lock, the CR cassette just doesn't need to be light tight because the CR plate is sensitive to X-rays, not visible light. So the phosphor plate, the actual plate that you guys were holding in your hand, that white plate with the back blacking. For most CR systems, the phosphor plate is what's called single emulsion. Film, the film you guys were holding, is what's called double emulsion. That means there's film on both sides, essentially. Both sides of that piece of film, it's able to expose. Okay, that made the image is better, easier, more efficient with film. With CR, they're what are called single emulsion. The phosphor plate part of it is only on the front. Okay. The functional material on here is the phosphorus portion of it. It's referred to as a photostimulable phosphor. You got to remember that. It is typically made of material called barium fluorohalide. Essentially salt and fluoride with barium. Anyways, it's a material, barium fluorohalide, which has a property that's called stimulated phosphorescence. Phosphorescence is when a material emits electromagnetic waves, light, when exposed to another type of light, like X-rays. Stimulated phosphorescence is when the material can be exposed to X-rays, be energized, but then not immediately release that energy. It hangs on to that energy, that exposure, for as long as we need it to. Not forever, but at least for the minutes that it takes to get the receptor to the processor, and even hours in some cases. Stimulated phosphorescence is the ability to store the latent image over time, then release that latent image on stimulation. One more time? How are they erased? Well, okay, so the phosphors store the X-ray energy, right? It stores it in the form of trapped electrons. When we send the plate into the processor uses a laser to essentially stimulate the plate to release its energy, okay? So the plate releases its energy, but the laser causes the plate to be a little energized too. So on the way out of the processor, a special wavelength of light is shined on the plate, and that erases the plate. The plate dumps all of its energy when that special wavelength of light hits it, and then so it does that coming back out of the receptor, and then it's ready to go again. Yeah, they have only pretty neat. They have only a usable life. Usable life for these plates is something between 3,000 and 5,000 images, 3,000 and 5,000 exposures. It's typical for a plate to get that many exposures within about a year or two. Okay, so these plates have to be replaced periodically. They're much cheaper than DR, but they have a much shorter usable life. And they don't cost nothing. A piece of film might cost a few dollars. Those imaging plates cost upwards of $900 to $1,000. So you're replacing them, every year or two, and you have probably between 2 and 4 of those plates, maybe even 6 or more at your facility. So they have to be replaced periodically. And the more you have, of course, the longer they will be used for, because you can, use them each one less. But they have a usable life, and eventually they don't erase very well. They stop being able to erase effectively. Okay, so stimulated phosphorescence. I need to describe a little bit about stimulated phosphorescence. And yeah, here we go. So stimulated phosphorescence. The material, barium fluorohalide, has a property to where the atoms, the way they join up, the way they're linked together, so this is down at the chemistry level, there are what are called metastable defects in the crystal structure of the barium fluorohalide. Barium fluorohalide with europium to be specific, but anyways, the material has this property to where when remember guys, X-ray photons can ionize matter. So when X-ray photons hit material, they can eject the electrons from that matter, right? In this case, when the X-ray photons strike the material, they ionize the electrons in the material, and the electrons are freed from the atoms that they were from. Okay, an electron absorbs the energy of an X-ray photon, and then it jumps out of the atom. Okay? If this were any other material, the electron would just go away from the atom. But in this special case, this special type of material, when the electrons are ionized from the atom after they absorb an X-ray photon, the electrons get trapped in between the atoms, and these electrons hang on to the energy that they just absorbed. Normally an electron, when it absorbs energy and absorbs a photon, it wants to re-emit that energy immediately. Okay? It does that by falling back down into the atom that it came from, right? In this case, the electrons jump out of the atom and then are stuck out of the atom. And they have to hang on to the energy that they just absorbed. They cannot just go back to their ground state because of the material. They are stuck, the electrons that absorb the X-ray photons are just stuck at a high energy level. They are stuck there until we release them, okay? Until we shine a special wavelength of light on them and cause them to jump back down into their atoms, and when they jump back down, they re-release the energy, okay? Electrons absorb X-ray photons, hang on to it, and then later down the road, we get them to release the energy that they stored. They release it in the forms of visible light, and they jump back down into their atoms, back down to their ground state. These spots where the electrons are trapped are called F centers. F centers for Farbrentzen. Okay? Remember F center. These, again, the purposeful design of this material is so that it can trap and hold on to electrons when they are ionized from their atoms. They get ionized when X-rays strike them. Okay, so the energy of these electrons trapped in the F centers are what form the latent image stored on the phosphor plate. Remember, an X-ray photon came through the patient, and then it hits a molecule, right where it needs to land, and that molecule emits an electron right where would represent that piece of body tissue. Okay, so effectively, the latent image is stored on the phosphor plate. And these electrons are freed from their atoms during the exposure, as I said, because X-rays can ionize them. The image can then be retrieved or read, potentially after several hours. There have been experiments done where the plates have been able to retain up to 75% of the original exposure after 8 hours of just sitting there. So these F centers that hold the energy of the electrons are able to hang on to it for a period of time, but not indefinitely. But for sure, they're able to hang on to that energy for as long as it takes you to walk from the X-ray room to the processor. That's what's important. All right, so now the plate is brought, I'll explain more about processing, but let's say, let's wave our hands and say the plate is brought into the processor, okay? To release the trapped energy, the crystals are excited by scanning them with a helium-neon red laser beam. So again, a special wavelength of light is used, a helium-neon red laser beam. This takes the electrons and it pumps them up. It gives them a lot of energy, okay? And then they are able to jump out of where they were trapped, raising up their potential energy, jumping out of where they were held, and back into the atoms that they came from. And as they fall back into their atoms, they have to lose energy to fall back down into those atomic shell levels. And as they lose energy, they emit characteristic wavelengths of light in shades of blue-violet light. Said in another way, as they jump back into their atoms, they emit visible light. How much visible light do they emit? Exactly as much as they absorbed with the X-ray photon energy. So whatever much energy they absorbed in the X-ray of X-ray photons, they emit that back out as visible light when they're processed, when the red laser light shines on them. That light emitted has to be captured and read by the computer, and that's the job of the processor. But the point is, those phosphor plates store energy in the form of trapped electrons. When the electrons are allowed to jump back into their atoms, they have to lower their energy that they are hanging on to, so they do that by emitting visible light. And again, they emit as much visible light as they absorb in X-ray photon energy. Something like this. You have a trapped electron, a single trapped electron. It's hanging on to the X-ray energy, and the laser beam comes along in the processor, strikes that electron. The electron emits visible light and jumps back into its home, back into its atom that it came from. That's the idea of this F-center material. Okay, the barium fluorohalide with europium happens to have this property that it can hang on, the electrons can hang on to energy for a period of time and then re-emit that energy later down the road in forms of visible light. Okay. So let's talk a little bit now about, let me pause here.